The autumn wind carried the scent of decay as the carriage rolled through the iron gates of Thornfield Manor, and Lady Elara Sinclair, now the Duchess of Thornfield, though the title felt like a borrowed coat that did not quite fit, pressed her gloved hand against the cold window pane, watching the grey stone edifice emerge from the mist like a spectre from some melancholic dream. The trees lining the drive had already surrendered their leaves, skeletal branches reaching toward a sky the color of slate, and she found herself thinking that everything here seemed to be in a state of mourning, though for what or whom she could not say. The wedding had taken place only that morning in the chapel of her father's estate, a ceremony so brief and silent it hardly seemed real. The Duke had spoken his vows in a voice devoid of inflection, had not met her eyes even once, had placed the ring upon her finger with hands that trembled, not with emotion, but with what appeared to be suppressed fury, or perhaps anguish. Now, as the carriage lurched to a stop before the manor's imposing entrance, Elara smoothed her travelling dress and reminded herself that she had entered this arrangement with open eyes, and that her family's debts had required this sacrifice, that she was a woman of 23 years and possessed the fortitude to endure whatever coldness awaited her within those walls. The Duke emerged first, his tall frame unfolding from the carriage with a grace that seemed at odds with the rigidity of his bearing, and he did not offer his hand to help her descend, did not even glance back to ensure she followed as he strode toward the entrance, where a line of servants stood assembled in the gathering dusk. Elara descended alone, her small trunk following behind, and made her way across the gravel drive with her chin raised, refusing to let her trepidation show. Inside, the manor was all dark wood and darker shadows, portraits of long-dead Thornfield staring down from the walls with expressions as forbidding as the current Duke's, and it was there, in the great hall, with its enormous fireplace crackling uselessly against the pervasive chill, that the Duke finally addressed her directly. "Mrs. Holloway will show you to your quarters," he said, his voice carrying the same emotional emptiness it had held during their vows, and when the elderly housekeeper stepped forward with something like pity in her eyes, Elara felt the first stirring of true unease. "Your Grace," Mrs. Holloway began carefully, "shall I prepare the Duchess's chambers?" The Duke's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the pale skin, and his grey eyes beautiful, Elara thought distantly, and utterly devoid of warmth, fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. "No," he said flatly. "The servants' wing, the small room overlooking the kitchen garden." The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, and Elara felt the shock of them ripple through her body, even as she maintained her composure, even as the servants shifted uncomfortably and averted their gazes. "The servants' quarters, Your Grace?" Mrs. Holloway echoed, clearly hoping she had misheard. "You will sleep in the servants' quarters," the Duke repeated, each word enunciated with cruel precision, and now his eyes did find Elara's, cold and challenging, as though daring her to object. "I trust that will be adequate for your needs, madam. If you require anything, you may inform Mrs. Holloway. I bid you good night." And with that, he turned and disappeared up the grand staircase, leaving Elara standing in the hall like an unwanted parcel, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling, and her heart, a leaden weight in her chest, as the servants' whispers began to rise around her, like the autumn wind outside, full of pity and scandal, and something that might have been fear. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. Now, let's begin. The room was small and plain, tucked beneath the eaves in the oldest part of the manor, where the servants had lived for generations. And as Mrs. Holloway lit the single lamp with hands that shook slightly, whether from age or distress, Elara could not determine the housekeeper's mouth worked as though she wished to speak, but could not find adequate words for such an unprecedented situation. "I am sorry, my lady," she finally managed, her weathered face creased with genuine anguish. "This is not right. His Grace, he was not always." But she trailed off, shaking her head, and Elara touched her arm gently, releasing her from the obligation of explanation. When the door closed and she was alone, Elara sank onto the narrow bed, so different from the grand canopied affair she had expected as a duchess, and allowed herself one moment of weakness, one silent tear that traced down her cheek before she wiped it away with fierce determination and rose to unpack her modest trunk. Through the thin walls, she could hear the kitchen staff below, their voices carrying upward through the floorboards, and though she knew eavesdropping was beneath her station, she found she could not help but listen as the cook's voice rose in indignant whisper. 3 years since Lady Catherine died, and still he punishes himself, and now this poor girl for crimes she never committed. Another voice, younger, responded. My aunt worked here before the tragedy. She said the Duke was different then, always laughing, always kind to the staff. Lady Catherine had that effect on him, brought out the warmth in him. But when she died, the voice dropped lower, and Ilara had to strain to hear. They say it haunts him still, what happened that night, that he blames himself, though it was nothing but a terrible accident. The conversation dissolved into murmurs Ilara could not decipher, but she stood frozen with her hands buried in her trunk, a silver-framed miniature of her mother clutched forgotten in her fingers, as understanding began to crystallize in her mind like frost on glass. The Duke was not cruel by nature, but by wound, not cold but frozen, trapped in some grief so profound it had transformed him into this hollow, hostile stranger who could not bear the sight of a wife he had been forced by duty and circumstance to take. Over the following days, as Ilara moved through the manor like a ghost herself, unseen, unacknowledged, existing in the margins of the household, she pieced together the tragedy from overheard fragments and careful observations. Lady Catherine Ashworth, beautiful and gentle, engaged to Duke Adrian when both were young and full of promise, had died 3 years prior on a winter's night, when her carriage overturned on the treacherous road from the village, and the Duke, who was to have met her that evening but had sent word to delay due to estate business, had been the one to find her broken body in the snow. The guilt, the servants whispered, had devoured him from within, had turned him into a man who walked through life, performing the motions of existence, but feeling nothing, wanting nothing, refusing connection, lest it lead once more to devastating loss. Now, unpacking the last of her belongings in this room that smelled of lavender and loneliness, Ilara placed her few books upon the rough wooden shelf and understood with sudden, painful clarity that she had been exiled, not as punishment for who she was, but as protection against what she might become, someone he could lose, someone whose loss might finally shatter what little remained of the Duke's fractured soul. Sleep would not come, though Ilara lay still as stone in the narrow bed, listening to the manor settle around her like an ancient creature easing its bones into rest, the creak of floorboards contracting in the autumn chill, the whisper of wind through cracks in the window pane, the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the depths of the house marking each second of her exile with methodical precision. She had left the lamp burning low, unwilling to surrender completely to the darkness of this strange place, and its flickering light cast shadows that danced across the sloped ceiling like phantoms of all the servants who had slept in this room before her, dreaming their simple dreams of days off and sweethearts and lives unburdened by the weight of noble obligation. The house had fallen silent near midnight, the last footsteps fading, the last doors closing, until Ilara felt herself utterly alone in a way she had never experienced, even in the most solitary moments of her girlhood, and she was just beginning to drift toward an uneasy sleep when the scream shattered the stillness like glass exploding in a quiet room. She bolted upright, heart hammering against her ribs, every sense suddenly sharp and alert as the sound echoed through the corridors. Not a cry of physical pain, but something far worse, something primal and anguished, the sound of a soul in torment. Without conscious thought, Ilara threw off her blankets and reached for her dressing gown, her hands fumbling with the ties as she moved toward the door and out into the dim hallway where a few wall sconces burned low, casting more shadow than light. The scream came again, muffled now but no less terrible, and she followed it like a dark thread through the labyrinth of corridors, past closed doors, behind which she imagined the servants lying awake and listening with the resignation of those who had heard this many times before. The sound led her to the east wing, to a pair of ornately carved doors that stood partially open, and through the gap she could see the flicker of firelight, and hear now not screaming but ragged breathing, gasping sobs that struck her heart with unexpected force. She took a step forward, her hand reaching toward the door, when a voice behind her made her freeze. "My lady, please." Mrs. Holloway stood in the hallway, a shawl wrapped around her nightdress, her face drawn with exhaustion and sorrow. Best not to interfere, but Ilara could not move, transfixed by the sounds of suffering emanating from those chambers, and she watched as two young footmen emerged from the Duke's rooms, their faces carefully blank, though their eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of horrors witnessed too often. "His Grace suffers nightmares, Mrs. Holloway explained tersely, coming to stand beside Elara and gently steering her away from the door. "They come most nights. There is nothing to be done. He will not accept comfort, will not see a physician, will not speak of what he dreams. We have learned it is best to let them pass." The breathing beyond the door had quieted now to something more controlled, though Elara thought she could still hear the ragged edge of suppressed weeping, and she allowed herself to be led back through the corridors toward her small room, her mind reeling with this new understanding. When she finally lay back in her bed, the lamp still burning, sleep remained as distant as ever, but now her wakefulness had a different quality, not the loneliness of exile, but a strange, aching compassion for the man who had banished her, the broken Duke who screamed in the darkness with no one to hold him, suffering alone in his grand chambers, while she lay alone in hers, both of them isolated by grief and duty, and the unbridgeable distance between what was and what might have been. The weeks unfolded with the slow inevitability of autumn itself, each day a variation on the theme of separation, and Elara learned the rhythms of Thornfield Manor, the way one learns to navigate a house in darkness, by careful attention, by the memorization of obstacles, by accepting that some rooms would remain forever closed to her. She took her meals in the small breakfast room off the kitchen, a space clearly meant for the housekeeper or upper servants, and though Mrs. Holloway insisted on setting the table with fine china, as befitted a duchess, the gesture only emphasized the absurdity of her situation, a noblewoman dining in exile, while her husband ate alone in the great dining hall 1 floor above. Her days acquired a quiet structure born of necessity, mornings spent walking the extensive grounds where the gardens were slowly surrendering to winter's approach, the roses dropping their petals like abandoned hopes, the fountains drained and covered, the hedgerows browning at their edges, afternoons in the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, where she would wait until she heard the Duke's footsteps retreating down the hall before slipping inside to lose herself in poetry and philosophy and novels of other people's lives. They passed each other occasionally in the corridors, these encounters unavoidable in a house they both inhabited, and each time Elara would nod politely, would murmur "Your Grace" in acknowledgement, and each time the Duke would give the barest inclination of his head before moving past her, as though she were merely another piece of furniture, another portrait on the wall to be glanced at and forgotten. Yet she observed him despite his attempts at invisibility, could not help but notice the details that accumulated like fallen leaves. The way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee at breakfast. On the rare occasions their schedules overlapped, the haunted quality of his grey eyes that suggested sleepless nights and waking nightmares, the careful distance he maintained, not just from her but from everyone, even the loyal servants who had known him since childhood. She watched him from her window one morning as he stood in the garden staring at a particular rose bush, his posture so rigid it seemed he might shatter, and only later did she learn from the gardener that Lady Catherine had planted those roses the summer before she died. She saw how the household staff moved around him with exaggerated care, speaking in hushed tones when he was near, and she understood that his cruelty was not cruelty at all, but rather a fortress built stone by stone from grief and guilt, a wall meant to keep the world at bay so that he might never again feel the devastating pain of loss. The autumn deepened around them, November approaching with its promise of darker days and longer nights, and Elara found herself no longer bitter about her banishment to the servants' quarters, but instead oddly grateful for it, for from this position on the margins she could observe without the burden of expectation, could begin to see past the Duke's frozen exterior to the suffering man beneath, could recognize in his careful isolation not rejection, but a terrible, misguided form of protection. He was not pushing her away because he hated her. She realized one afternoon as she watched him through the library window, standing alone in the dying garden, with his shoulders bowed beneath some invisible weight, but because he could not bear to let her close enough to lose. The storm arrived near midnight with the violence of something long suppressed, finally breaking free. Rain lashing against the windows in waves that sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry god, and Elara woke from uneasy dreams to find her small room illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning that turned the familiar shadows strange and menacing. She lay listening to the thunder roll across the moors, counting the seconds between flash and sound the way her mother had taught her as a child, and was just beginning to drift back towards sleep when the knocking came soft at first, almost tentative, then more insistent, a rhythm that seemed to carry within it some desperate urgency. For a moment she thought she had imagined it, that the storm was playing tricks with her senses, but then it came again, and she rose quickly, reaching for her dressing gown and tying it securely before moving to the door. Her mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened? Was there an emergency in the household? Had the storm caused some damage that required her attention despite her marginal status in this place? She pulled open the door and froze, her breath catching in her throat at the sight before her. The Duke stood in the dim corridor, his dark hair disheveled and falling across his forehead, his nightshirt open at the collar, revealing the pale column of his throat, and his eyes, those grey eyes that were usually so carefully shuttered, were wide and wild, with a terror so raw it seemed to strip away every defense he had constructed, leaving him exposed and vulnerable as a child woken from nightmare. He swayed slightly on his feet, and Ilara realized with a shock that pierced through her own confusion that he was not fully conscious. He was moving through some half-waking state where dream and reality blurred into one terrible landscape. "Catherine?" he whispered, his voice breaking on the name, and he reached toward her with a hand that trembled violently, his face transformed by such desperate hope and anguish that Ilara felt tears spring to her own eyes unbidden. "Catherine, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, please." And then, like a man surfacing from deep water, awareness crashed back into his features, and she watched the exact moment when he recognized where he was, who she was, what he had done. The horror that flooded his expression was almost worse than the terror that had preceded it, a mortification so complete that he actually stumbled backward, his hand falling to his side as though he had been burned. "Your Grace," Ilara began, her voice gentle, wanting desperately to ease the shame she saw written across every line of his body, but he was already turning away, already fleeing down the corridor with his nightshirt billowing behind him like the wings of some wounded bird. "Wait," she called after him, stepping into the hallway, her hand outstretched though he was already too far to reach. "Please, wait." But he was gone, disappeared into the darkness and the storm, and Ilara stood alone in the doorway of her small room, with the rain drumming overhead, and her heart aching with a compassion so fierce it surprised her, for she had just witnessed what all the Duke's careful coldness had been constructed to hide, not indifference, not cruelty, but a grief so profound and a vulnerability so absolute that he could not bear for anyone to see it. And yet he had come to her door in his moment of greatest need, had sought her out through the labyrinth of his nightmares, had stood before her, stripped of all pretense, and in that brief, terrible moment, before shame drove him away, she had seen the man he might have been, the man he still was beneath the armor of ice. 3 nights later it happened again, and then again 5 nights after that, and by the time November settled fully over Thornfield Manor with its grey skies and early darkness, Ilara had come to recognize the pattern as clearly as she recognized the morning bells that called the household to waking. The storms were not always necessary, for the Duke's nightmares followed their own meteorology, but they came with increasing frequency, and always, he found his way through the maze of corridors to her door in the servants' quarters, drawn by some unconscious need he could neither understand nor control. Each time was a variation on that first terrible encounter. Sometimes he would knock, and she would open the door to find him already turning away, awareness having caught him before she could respond. Other times he would simply stand in the hallway outside her room, his forehead pressed against the wall beside her door, his breathing ragged, and she would open it quietly to find him there like a penitent at a shrine he did not believe in but could not stop visiting. Once he actually entered when she opened the door, took 3 steps into her small room before his eyes focused, and he saw where he was, the mortification crashing over him like a wave before he bolted without a word. She learned not to speak during these encounters, for her voice seemed to shatter whatever fragile state held him, seemed to pull him too quickly back to consciousness and shame, and so she would simply open her door when the soft knock came, would watch him with compassion as awareness returned and sent him fleeing, would close the door again and return to her bed with her heart full of an ache she could not name. After the fourth visitation, Elara began to prepare for them the way one prepares for an expected guest. She left a lamp burning low through the night, kept the kettle on the small brazier in her room so that water stayed warm, procured chamomile and lavender from Mrs. Holloway with some vague excuse about difficulty sleeping that the housekeeper accepted with knowing eyes. She set out a second cup beside her own, laid a blanket across the chair near the fire, created a space of welcome should the Duke ever stay long enough to accept it, though each time he fled before she could offer anything but her silent presence. During their daytime encounters, those careful passings in corridors, those moments when they occupied the same rooms in stiff, formal proximity, she never mentioned his nocturnal visits, never let her expression betray that she knew how he came to her door in his most vulnerable moments, never gave any indication that she had witnessed him calling another woman's name with such desperate longing. She preserved his dignity with the same fierce protectiveness she would have afforded any wounded creature, understanding instinctively that to acknowledge these visits would be to drive him further into isolation, to add shame upon shame, until the weight became unbearable. Something shifted in her during those weeks, a transformation as subtle and inexorable as the changing season. She stopped resenting her exile to the servants' quarters and began instead to see it as a strange gift, for her proximity to the household's margins had placed her precisely where the Duke's unconscious mind sought comfort, and she understood now that he had not banished her to punish but to protect, and yet his own fractured psyche had betrayed his intentions, drawing him night after night to the one place he had sworn she would remain, the one person he had determined to keep at the greatest distance. The fifth time he came to her door, the storm outside was so fierce that the entire manor seemed to shudder beneath its assault, and when Elara opened to his knock, she found the Duke leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face ashen with exhaustion, his eyes bearing the haunted look of a man who has been awake for too many nights and can no longer remember what peace feels like. "Catherine," he whispered as always, but this time when awareness returned and shame began to flood his features, something in him simply broke, not dramatically, not with the violence of thunder, but with the quiet finality of a rope worn thin, finally snapping, and instead of fleeing, he simply stood there, swaying slightly, looking at her with an expression so lost that Elara acted without thought. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside, and when he did not move, she reached out carefully, as one might reach for a frightened animal, and touched his arm with the lightest pressure. "Please, you're exhausted. Let me make you some tea." Perhaps it was the gentleness of her voice, or perhaps he had simply run out of strength to maintain his defenses, but he allowed her to guide him into her small room, allowed her to settle him into the chair by the fire, while she busied herself with the kettle and the chamomile she had kept waiting for, precisely this moment. The storm raged against the windows, rain streaming down the glass in sheets, and in the lamplight the Duke looked almost ghostly, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as though he might float away without such anchor. She pressed the warm cup into his hands, and he took it automatically, and they sat in silence for a long moment. She on the edge of her narrow bed, he in the chair, the space between them charged with all the words that had never been spoken. "I dream of that night," he said finally, his voice rough and low, as though the words were being dragged from some deep place within him. "The night she died. I dream that I'm driving the carriage myself, that I can see the moment when the wheel catches on the ice, when everything begins to overturn, and I try to stop it but my hands won't move, my voice won't work, and I can only watch as she—" His voice broke, and he stared down into his cup, as though it might contain some answer to questions he could not articulate. "It was my fault. I was supposed to meet her that evening. She was coming from the village because I had sent word asking her to come, and if I had not, if I had simply gone to her instead, if I had waited one more day—" He stopped, shaking his head, and when he continued his words came haltingly, each one seeming to cost him something. "The nightmares never stop. I thought if I kept everyone away, if I refused to let anyone close, I could contain it, could keep the darkness from spreading to others. I thought isolation was protection. But the darkness follows anyway. It finds me every night. And now—" He looked up at her for the first time, really looked at her, and his grey eyes were raw with shame and confusion. "Now I come to your door, though I have no memory of walking here, no conscious thought of seeking you out. and I wake to find myself standing before you like some madman, calling for a ghost. I have treated you abominably. I have exiled you to servants' quarters, ignored you, made you unwelcome in what should be your home, and still you—" He gestured helplessly at the tea, at the lamp she kept burning, at the quiet acceptance in her face. Elara set down her own cup and leaned forward slightly, her voice steady and clear despite the emotions swelling in her chest. "You are not a madman. You are grieving, and grief does not follow rules or timelines or logic. You come to my door because some part of you knows you should not be alone in your suffering, even if your waking mind refuses to acknowledge it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I do not need you to apologize for your treatment of me. I need you to know that you are heard, that what you carry is real and heavy and deserves to be spoken aloud, not locked away where it festers in darkness." And in that small room with the storm raging outside and the lamp casting its gentle light, the Duke of Thornfield wept for the first time since Catherine's death, and for the first time in 3 years, felt the presence of another human being who did not try to fix him or tell him to move on, but simply bore witness to his pain with compassion that asked nothing in return. The change came not as a sudden thaw, but as the gradual softening of frost beneath tentative sunlight, barely perceptible at first, easy to dismiss as imagination or wishful thinking until the accumulated evidence became undeniable. It began 3 days after their conversation in her small room, when Elara entered the breakfast room to find the Duke already there, an unprecedented occurrence, as their schedules had been carefully, unconsciously arranged to avoid such overlap, and instead of rising to leave as she expected, he simply looked up from his newspaper, met her eyes for a fraction of a second, and inclined his head in the smallest of acknowledgments before returning to his reading. The gesture was minute, almost nothing, but it was something, and Elara felt it like warmth against her skin as she took her seat at the modest table. 2 mornings later, as she reached for the marmalade, his voice cut through the silence. "Did you sleep well, Lady Elara?" The question was stiff, formal, clearly unpracticed, but it was a question nonetheless, an acknowledgement of her existence beyond the peripheral, and she answered with equal care, "Well enough, thank you, Your Grace," and watched something like relief flicker across his features before the mask of reserve settled back into place. The following week brought more small offerings. He mentioned over breakfast that the main library was poorly heated, and perhaps she would prefer the smaller sitting room for her reading. He inquired, awkwardly, whether she had everything she required for her comfort. He suggested, with a diffidence that spoke of internal struggle, that she might use the main library whenever she wished, that her confinement to hours when he was absent had been unnecessarily cruel. The servants noticed these shifts with the acute awareness of those whose livelihoods depend on reading the moods of their masters, and Elara caught the knowing glances exchanged between footmen, the small smile that touched Mrs. Holloway's lips when the Duke asked the housekeeper to ensure Lady Elara had access to the conservatory, and the way the household staff began to treat her with a warmth that had been held carefully in reserve during the weeks of her exile. Mrs. Holloway herself softened considerably, taking tea with Elara one afternoon in the small breakfast room and speaking with quiet approval. "You have been very patient with His Grace, my lady, more patient than many would have been. He is lucky to have someone who sees past the walls he builds." It was on a grey December afternoon, while wandering the portrait gallery in search of distraction from the relentless gloom outside, that Elara discovered the Duke standing motionless before a large canvas, and she knew, without being told, that this was Catherine, the woman whose ghost had haunted these halls for 3 years, whose name the Duke still called in his nightmares, whose death had transformed him from the warm, promising man the servants remembered into the hollow figure who now stood gazing at her painted face with an expression of such complex sorrow that Elara felt intrusive, simply witnessing it. She almost turned to leave, to grant him privacy in his grief, but something made her stay, made her walk quietly forward until she stood beside him in silence, 2 people looking at the image of a third who would never age, never change, forever young and lovely in her frame. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with significance, and finally Elara spoke, her voice soft and without artifice. She was beautiful. The Duke's shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, relaxed fractionally, and when he responded, his voice carried a quality she had not heard before, not the cold formality of their public interactions, not the raw anguish of his nightmare-torn confessions, but something gentler, more human. "She was kind," he said, and then, after a pause that seemed to contain both acknowledgement and apology, "like you." The morning walks began without formal arrangement or spoken invitation, simply evolved from the coincidence of their paths, crossing one December morning when the frost lay thick upon the grounds and their breath made clouds in the frigid air. And the Duke, instead of nodding and continuing past as had become his recent custom, paused and said, "The East Gardens are quite beautiful at this hour, if you would care to see them." And Ilara, surprised but careful not to show it, replied that she would like that very much. They walked that first morning on opposite sides of the gravel path, the width of the walkway between them like a demilitarized zone, neither speaking beyond the occasional practical comment about the weather or the condition of the grounds, but there was something in the shared silence that felt less lonely than the solitary walks Ilara had grown accustomed to, and when they parted at the manor's entrance, the Duke inclined his head and said, "Perhaps tomorrow, if it does not rain," and she understood it was a question rather than a statement. The walks became ritual, occurring each morning that weather permitted and sometimes even when it did not, both of them apparently finding that cold and damp were preferable to isolation, and gradually, incrementally, the silence between them filled with words. The Duke would point out a particular oak tree and mention how he had climbed it as a boy and broken his arm falling from its branches, how his father had been furious but his mother had laughed while binding the fracture. Ilara would speak of her own childhood, of growing up in a household where books were treasured above all else, where her father had encouraged her curiosity even as society frowned upon educated women. They shared memories like carefully wrapped gifts, testing whether the other would receive them with care or carelessness, and finding always that gentleness met gentleness, that vulnerability was honored rather than exploited. The Duke told her of the estate's history, pointing out the folly his grandfather had built for his grandmother, the walled garden his mother had designed, the meadow where the village held its harvest festivals in years gone by, and in these small sharings, Ilara began to see not just the isolated, grief-stricken man, but the layers beneath the boy who had loved this land, the young man who had dreamed of filling it with family and laughter, the broken soul who still, despite everything, tended it with devotion. And as the weeks passed and winter deepened, the physical distance between them gradually, almost imperceptibly lessened. They walked no longer on opposite sides of the path, but both on the same side, separated by several feet. Then those feet contracted to mere inches, and finally, on a morning when ice made the walkways treacherous, the Duke offered his arm with studied casualness, and Ilara took it with the same careful nonchalance, and they continued their walk as though this intimacy had always existed, as though the warmth of contact through layers of winter clothing was unremarkable rather than revolutionary. Neither acknowledged this shift, neither commented on how they now walked close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed, how their steps had synchronized into a matched rhythm, how the silence between them had transformed from the emptiness of strangers into the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed words to communicate presence and acceptance, but both felt it, this subtle drawing together, this gradual collapse of the distance that grief and fear had erected between them. The library had become Ilara's refuge during the long afternoons, when the winter light failed early and the manor seemed to close in upon itself, and it was there on a particularly cold January evening that she found him, the Duke slumped in one of the leather wingback chairs near the fire, his head tilted at an angle that would surely cause pain upon waking, a leather-bound volume of Wordsworth lying open on the floor, where it had slipped from his relaxed fingers. The firelight played across his face, softening the harsh lines that grief and sleeplessness had carved there, and in repose he looked younger, more like the man he must have been before tragedy had aged him. Beyond his years, his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheeks, his mouth relaxed from its usual tight line, one hand fallen palm up on the chair's arm in an attitude of surrender. Ilara stood in the doorway for a long moment, debating whether to retreat and leave him to his rest, but the fire had burned low, and the room had taken on a distinct chill, and she could see the slight shiver that ran through his frame even in sleep, the way his body sought warmth it could not find. Moving with careful quietness, she crossed to the cabinet, where she knew blankets were kept. For precisely such purposes the library was notoriously difficult to heat, its high ceilings and large windows conspiring against comfort, and selected a thick woolen throw in deep burgundy. She approached the sleeping Duke with the same caution she had learned to employ during his nocturnal visits to her door, aware that any sudden movement might startle him into wakefulness and the inevitable withdrawal that would follow. And she was just settling the blanket across his shoulders when his eyes opened, grey and momentarily unfocused, with the disorientation of unexpected waking. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, Elara frozen with her hands still adjusting the blanket's drape, Adrian blinking slowly as awareness returned, and he registered where he was, who she was, what was happening. "You were cold," she said simply, straightening but not stepping away, offering explanation without apology or embarrassment. He looked down at the blanket, at her hands that had just released it, and something moved across his face, surprise, perhaps, or confusion, or the beginning of something else entirely. "Why do you care?" The question emerged raw and unguarded, without the formal distance he usually maintained, and she could hear in it genuine bewilderment, as though kindness were a foreign concept he could no longer pass. "Because you're suffering," Elara answered, meeting his eyes with steady honesty, "and I cannot watch suffering and do nothing. It is not in my nature to turn away from pain, especially when that pain belongs to someone who has tried very hard to convince the world he feels nothing at all." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their directness, and she watched something crack in his carefully constructed armor, watched his expression shift from bewilderment to something more vulnerable, more open. Not love. It was far too soon for love, but perhaps the first tentative possibility of it, the recognition that this woman before him saw him truly and did not recoil, that she had witnessed his worst moments and remained, that her compassion was not pity but respect, an acknowledgement of his humanity despite all his efforts to deny it. The invitation to dinner came via Mrs. Holloway, delivered with barely suppressed pleasure and a knowing glint in her eye. His Grace requested Lady Elara's presence in the dining room that evening at 8 o'clock, and would she be so kind as to join him for a proper meal? It was, Elara understood, the first time since her arrival at Thornfield Manor that such an invitation had been extended, the first acknowledgement that she was not merely an inconvenient obligation to be shuffled aside, but the Duchess of this house, his wife-in-law if not yet in practice, and she dressed with more care than usual, selecting a gown of deep emerald that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened her mother's pearl necklace at her throat. The dining room was vast and formal, the table long enough to seat 30, but place settings had been arranged at one end, close enough for conversation, and the Duke rose when she entered, his movements stiff with nervousness, as he held her chair, a gesture of courtesy he had never before offered. They spoke little during the first courses, the silence occasionally broken by polite remarks about the food or careful observations about the weather, both of them navigating this new territory with the caution of diplomats treading through a minefield. But as the meal progressed and wine softened the edges of their mutual uncertainty, the conversation found easier rhythms, touched on books they had both read, places they had both visited, memories that did not include ghosts. It was over dessert, a delicate pear tart that Elara barely tasted, that the Duke set down his fork with deliberate precision, drew a breath as though preparing for battle, and spoke with a formality that barely concealed the emotion beneath. "I have instructed Mrs. Holloway to have your belongings moved to the Duchess's chambers, where you should have been from the beginning." The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, and Elara felt her heart quicken as he continued, his voice growing rougher, thick with regret. "I was cruel, I was afraid, I'm still afraid, but—" He stopped, struggled, and she could see the war being waged behind his eyes, the desire to retreat warring with the determination to push forward, and finally he simply shook his head, unable or unwilling to complete the thought, but the unfinished sentence hung there pregnant with possibility. "Thank you," Elara said softly, seeing not just the practical gesture but the immense courage it had required, understanding that this man who had spent 3 years building walls was now, brick by painful brick, beginning to dismantle them. "I accept, with gratitude." That night she found herself in the Duchess's chambers, rooms she had glimpsed only in passing during her early explorations of the manor, vast and beautifully appointed, with a canopied bed large enough for 3 people, windows overlooking the moonlit gardens, a dressing room lined with wardrobes and mirrors, everything a duchess could want or require. The servants had moved her modest belongings with touching care, her few books arranged on shelves that could hold hundreds, her simple dresses hanging in wardrobes meant for extensive trousseau, and as she lay in that grand bed beneath embroidered coverlets, she found herself missing her small room under the eaves, with its sloped ceiling and thin walls, missing the intimate space where the Duke had come to her door in his moments of greatest vulnerability, and she wondered with a pang whether he would still find his way to her now that she slept in chambers so far from the servants' quarters, so distant from the marginal spaces where broken things could meet without pretense. Winter settled over Thornfield Manor like a benediction, snow transforming the bleak grounds into something softened and almost magical, and with the turn of the new year came rhythms that felt less like accommodation and more like genuine companionship. Breakfast together each morning at 8, where they discussed the day's plans over coffee and toast. At afternoon walks when weather permitted, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their breath mingling in the cold air. Evenings in the library, where they would read in comfortable proximity, occasionally sharing passages aloud or debating some point of philosophy or poetry. They were learning to inhabit the same spaces without the careful distance that had characterized those early weeks, learning that shared silence could be as intimate as conversation, that the simple presence of another person could transform a room from lonely to peaceful. Adrian smiled occasionally, now small expressions at first, barely more than a softening of his usual serious mien, but gradually becoming more frequent, more genuine, brief flashes of the man he must have been before grief had carved away his capacity for lightness. Ilara discovered that he possessed a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly, a subtle humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh in ways that seemed to surprise and please him equally. He began to ask her questions during their walks, genuine inquiries that went beyond politeness, about her family, her childhood, her favorite books and why they moved her, about her dreams for the future, what she hoped to accomplish, what brought her joy. She learned in turn about him through observation and conversation, discovered his surprising gentleness with the estate workers, the way he knew each tenant family by name and circumstance, how he could spend an hour discussing crop rotation with the farmers or listening to the gardener's theories about soil composition. She discovered his passion for astronomy, how on clear nights he would retreat to the observatory his grandfather had built and spend hours mapping the stars, finding in their distant patterns some comfort unavailable in earthly affairs. One evening, he invited her to join him there, and she stood shivering despite her cloak as he pointed out constellations, his voice taking on a quality of wonder as he spoke of infinite space and the smallness of human concerns beneath such vastness, and she understood that this was his way of managing grief by placing it in cosmic perspective, by reminding himself that pain, however intense, was merely one small note in an incomprehensibly large symphony. They were becoming friends, she realized one morning in late February as they walked through the snow-covered gardens, in their footsteps, the only marks in the fresh powder. Genuine friends who knew each other's wounds and habits and preferences, who could anticipate each other's thoughts, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in mood and expression that others might miss. Yet beneath this friendship ran an undercurrent of something else, something neither was quite ready to name or acknowledge. The way her heart quickened when he smiled at her, the way his hand would linger a fraction too long when helping her over icy patches, the way they had begun unconsciously to stand closer together and to seek out each other's company not from obligation but from genuine desire, to feel incomplete when circumstances forced them apart for a day. The nightmare came in March, during the last gasp of winter, when the cold seems most bitter because spring has been promised but not yet delivered, and Ilara woke not to knocking at her door but to the sound of screaming that carried through the corridors of Thornfield Manor with such raw anguish that she was out of bed and running before conscious thought could intervene, her feet bare on the cold floors, her nightgown billowing behind her as she navigated the familiar route to the Duke's chambers. She did not knock, did not pause at the threshold to consider propriety or permission, simply pushed through the heavy doors to find him thrashing in the great canopied bed, his face contorted with terror, his voice hoarse from screaming words she could not quite distinguish Catherine's name, apologies, desperate pleas that seemed torn from some deep place of unbearable guilt. Two servants hovered uncertainly in the doorway behind her, But Ilara waved them away and moved to the bedside, sitting carefully on the mattress's edge and reaching for his hand, which was clenched into a fist against his chest. "Adrian," she said firmly, using his given name for the first time, and when he did not respond, she said it again, louder, her other hand touching his shoulder with gentle pressure. "Adrian, wake up! You're dreaming! Wake up!" His eyes flew open, wild and unseeing, and for a terrible moment she thought he might strike out in his confusion. But then awareness crashed in, and he saw her, really saw her, and the terror in his expression transformed into something even more devastating: recognition, shame, and beneath it all, a desperate, drowning need. He was shaking violently, his entire body trembling as though with fever. And without hesitation, Ilara moved closer, gathering his hand between both of hers, grounding him with her touch. "Tell me," she urged softly but firmly. "Tell me what you saw. Don't keep it locked inside where it festers. Tell me." And he did, the words tumbling out in broken fragments at first, then flowing like a dam finally breached. The whole terrible story of that winter night 3 years ago. How Catherine had been visiting her sister in the village. How he had sent word asking her to return that evening because he had something important to discuss. How he had waited for her in the drawing room with a ring in his pocket, planning to propose moving their wedding date forward because he could not bear to wait another 6 months. How the hours had passed and she had not arrived. How he had grown concerned and finally ventured out himself to find her carriage overturned on the icy road, the horses screaming in the darkness, Catherine's body lying impossibly still in the snow, her neck broken, her eyes open and staring at nothing. "If I had not sent for her," he said, his voice breaking, "if I had simply waited until morning, if I had been patient instead of eager, she would still be alive. I killed her with my impatience, my selfishness, or my need to have everything immediately." The tears came then, finally, after 3 years of frozen grief, streaming down his face as his breath came in ragged gasps. "And I am terrified, terrified that if I allow myself to care for you, if I let myself feel anything real, I will lose you too. And I cannot survive that loss again. I cannot." But Ilara was already holding him, pulling his head to her shoulder, her arms wrapping around his shaking frame as he broke completely, and she held him through the storm of grief that had been building for years, whispering against his hair that he was not alone, that she was here, that his fear was understandable but his guilt was undeserved, that loving carried risk, but that risk was what made us human. Dawn broke pale and hesitant over Thornfield Manor, the first light filtering through the heavy curtains of the Duke's chambers, to find them still together. Ilara sitting against the headboard, with Adrian's head resting against her shoulder, her arms around him in a posture that would have scandalized anyone who witnessed it, though both were far beyond caring about propriety in this moment of raw honesty. She had felt him finally relax into exhausted sleep near 4 in the morning, his breathing evening out, his grip on her hand loosening, and she had remained motionless rather than risk waking him, and now as consciousness returned to him, she felt his body stiffen with awareness, felt embarrassment begin to flood through him as he registered their position, the intimacy of it, the vulnerability he had displayed. He pulled away carefully, sitting up and running a hand through his disheveled hair, unable to meet her eyes, and she could see him beginning to construct the familiar walls, to retreat behind formality and distance, and she refused to allow it. "Adrian," she said firmly, using his name again with deliberate intent, and when he still would not look at her, she reached out and gently touched his chin, turning his face toward hers. "What you showed me last night wasn't weakness, it was trust, and trust is the bravest thing a person can offer." He shook his head, his expression anguished, but she continued before he could speak. "You have spent 3 years believing that to feel is to invite destruction, that to open yourself to connection is to guarantee loss. But you trusted me enough to break in my presence, and that took more courage than any armor you've constructed." They talked as the sun rose fully, filling the room with cold morning light, and eventually moved to the small table by the window, where a servant, Mrs. Holloway, certainly, who missed nothing, had quietly delivered breakfast without knocking or intruding. Over coffee and eggs that neither touched with much appetite, Adrian spoke with a hesitancy that revealed how unpracticed he was at such honesty. "I have been seeing you," he said carefully, "not as an obligation or as a reminder of duty, but as yourself, Ilara, who reads philosophy and walks in the cold and shows compassion to broken things. You are fascinating. You are kind. You are resilient in ways I cannot begin to comprehend." He paused, struggling with the words. "I don't deserve your patience. I have treated you abominably, exiled you, ignored you, made you suffer for crimes you never committed." But Ilara interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. I did not offer you patience because you earned it, or because I expected gratitude or recompense. I offered it because you needed it, and because some part of me, perhaps the part that recognized a fellow soul struggling to find solid ground, wanted to offer it." She leaned forward slightly, holding his gaze. "You keep speaking of what you deserve or don't deserve, as though life operates on some system of fair exchange. But it doesn't. Pain comes to those who don't deserve it. Joy comes unearned. All we can do is receive what we're given with grace and try to be gentle with each other in the meantime." Something shifted in his expression, a softening of the perpetual tension he carried, and for the first time since she had known him, Adrian smiled fully, not the brief flashes she had grown accustomed to, but a real smile that transformed his face and made her see clearly the man he had been before grief reshaped him. Spring arrived tentatively, as though uncertain of its welcome after winter's long dominion, and the gardens of Thornfield Manor began their slow awakening snowdrops, pushing through the last patches of snow, buds swelling on bare branches, the earth softening and releasing its scent of thaw and promise. It was during their morning walk through these transforming grounds, the air still crisp, but carrying an edge of warmth that spoke of longer days to come, that Adrian reached for Ilara's hand, not unconsciously as he had done when guiding her over icy patches, but deliberately, intentionally, his fingers finding hers and intertwining with a gentle pressure that asked a question his voice could not form. She answered by curling her fingers around his, by continuing to walk as though this contact were the most natural thing in the world, rather than the monumental shift it represented. And they moved together through the garden paths, speaking of inconsequential things, the progress of the crocuses, the plans for spring planting, a book she had been reading while both acutely aware of every point where their skin touched, of the warmth flowing between their joined hands, of the boundary they were crossing, with this simple gesture that felt somehow more intimate than all their late-night conversations and shared vulnerabilities. They walked for nearly an hour that way, fingers intertwined, and when they finally returned to the manor and released each other to attend to their separate morning obligations, Ilara could still feel the imprint of his touch like a phantom warmth against her palm. That evening found them in the library as had become their custom, reading in companionable silence, but there was a new quality to the quiet now, a charged awareness that made every accidental meeting of eyes significant, every shift of position fraught with meaning. When the clock struck 10 and Ilara rose to retire, Adrian stood as well, and walked with her through the corridors toward the grand staircase, something he had not done before, and at the foot of the stairs he stopped, turning to face her with an expression that mingled hope and trepidation. "Ilara," he said softly, and she noted with a flutter in her chest that he now used her given name naturally, without self-consciousness. May I kiss you good night?" The formality of the request, the way he asked permission rather than simply taking what might be considered his husbandly right, moved her deeply, and she nodded, tilting her face slightly in offering. He leaned forward slowly, carefully, as though approaching something precious and fragile, and pressed his lips to her cheek with such gentleness that she barely felt the contact, yet it resonated through her entire body, like a bell struck in an empty room. This chaste kiss that felt like a promise, like the beginning of something they were both afraid to name, but could no longer deny. They were moving slowly, carefully, both aware of the fragility of what was growing between them, aware that trust once shattered took time to rebuild, that hearts once broken needed gentleness to heal, but it was growing nonetheless. Undeniable as the crocuses pushing through the last snow, as inevitable as spring following winter, this tender thing blooming between two people who had both believed themselves beyond the reach of such sweetness. The summons came after dinner on an April evening when the last light lingered golden in the western sky. Adrian's voice quiet but intent as he asked if she would accompany him to the portrait gallery, and something in his manner, a nervous energy, a purposefulness, made Ilara's heart quicken as she agreed and followed him through the familiar corridors. The gallery was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, portraits of generations of Thornfields, watching from their frames with painted eyes, and Elara noticed immediately what had changed. Catherine's portrait, which had hung in isolated prominence at the gallery's center like a shrine, had been moved to its proper chronological place among the family ancestors, still honored, still beautiful, but no longer the singular focus of the room, no longer separated from the flow of history, as though her death had stopped time itself. Adrian stood before the portrait, his hands clasped behind his back, and when he spoke, his voice carried a steadiness that came from hard-won resolution. I will always honor what she meant to me. Catherine was my first love, and her death nearly destroyed me. For 3 years I have kept her here, isolated, as though by preserving her separateness I could somehow keep her alive, keep the past from becoming truly past. He turned to face Elara, and she could see the evidence of struggle and victory both written in his expression. But I cannot live in the past anymore. You've shown me that. You've shown me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, that moving forward isn't betrayal, that it's possible to honor what was while still embracing what is. He moved toward her, closing the distance between them, and took both her hands in his grip warm and slightly trembling. We're already married in law, bound by contracts and ceremonies neither of us chose. But I would like to marry you in heart, Elara. I would like to stand before you now, in this moment, and offer you not obligation but choice, my choice to love you, to build a life with you, to try every day to be worthy of the patience and compassion you've shown me. His grey eyes, which had been so cold and shuttered when she first arrived at Thornfield, and now held depths of emotion that made her breath catch. If you'll have me, not the broken man you were given, thrust upon you by circumstance and necessity, but the man I am trying to become, the man who is healing. Yes, still healing, perhaps always healing, but healing because of you, because you refused to accept my walls, because you saw past my cruelty to the suffering beneath and offered grace instead of judgment. His voice roughened with emotion, and she could feel the tremor in his hands. I cannot promise you the man I was before Catherine died. That man is gone, and perhaps that's as it should be, but I can promise you the man I am now, flawed and scarred but trying, always trying, to be better, to be open, to choose love, even knowing it carries the risk of loss. Will you marry me, Elara? Will you have me, not in law but in truth? Elara felt tears gather in her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition of this moment's significance, and when she spoke her voice trembled but held steady, carrying the weight of truth she had been learning these past months. Yes, she said simply at first, letting the word stand alone for a heartbeat before continuing. But it is more than yes, Adrian. It is yes with understanding, yes with my whole heart, yes with the knowledge of what we are truly offering each other. She tightened her grip on his hands, holding him as surely as he held her. I came to Thornfield resigned to a loveless duty, prepared to endure a marriage of convenience and obligation, expecting nothing more than cold formality and separate lives lived under the same roof. But I found something I never anticipated, not a fairy tale rescue where some perfect hero saves a helpless maiden, but something far more real and far more precious. Two people learning to heal together, teaching each other through patience and presence that wholeness is possible even after breaking. She paused, searching for the right words to convey what she needed him to understand. You think you are the only one being healed in this, that I am somehow whole while you are fractured, but that isn't true. You've healed me too, Adrian. You've shown me that strength isn't in never breaking, that courage isn't in maintaining a perfect facade, but in having the bravery to try again after loss, to remain open after pain, to choose vulnerability, even when every instinct screams for self-protection. You've taught me that the most profound human connections come not from presenting our best selves, but from allowing another person to witness our worst and discovering they don't turn away. Tears were streaming down in her face now, and she saw answering moisture in his eyes as she continued. So yes, I will marry you in heart. I will choose you every day, not the man you were or the man you think you should be, but exactly the man you are in this moment, scarred and healing, and brave enough to love again, despite knowing what love can cost. And then he was pulling her close, one hand rising to cup her face with infinite gentleness, and he kissed her properly for the first time, not the chaste press of lips to cheek, but a real kiss, soft and tentative and full of promise, tasting faintly of salt from their mingled tears, and Elara felt something within her chest expand and bloom like spring arriving after endless winter. They stood together in the portrait gallery for a long time after, the foreheads touching, breathing each other's breath, neither willing to break the spell of this moment, and when they finally made their way to their separate chambers, for some boundaries still required time to dissolve, they did so with the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted, that they were no longer two isolated people bound by legal obligation, but two souls choosing each other with full awareness and open hearts. That night, for the first time since Catherine's death, Adrian slept peacefully through until morning without nightmares troubling his rest, and if he woke at all, it was only to smile in the darkness, knowing that in a nearby chamber Elara lay sleeping too, knowing she had chosen him, knowing he was no longer alone. Spring bloomed fully across Thornfield Manor, transforming the estate from its grey winter morning into something vibrant and alive, and with the changing season came changes within the house itself. As Adrian began systematically opening rooms that had been closed since Catherine's death, drawing back curtains to let light flood into spaces that had languished in the darkness, instructing servants to remove Holland covers from furniture, ordering fires lit in hearths that had grown cold, until the manor itself seemed to breathe again after years of holding its breath. Laughter echoed in the halls now, startling at first in its unfamiliarity, then gradually becoming woven into the fabric of daily life. Elara's bright mirth at something Adrian said over breakfast, his low chuckle at her dry observations about the visiting vicar, the shared amusement that passed between them in glances and small smiles that needed no words. They hosted a small gathering in May, their first social event, inviting neighboring families for dinner and cards, and Elara watched Adrian move through the evening with a grace that spoke of the man he had once been, charming, attentive, present in a way he had not been for years, and she heard the whispered remarks of their guests, the wonder at the Duke's transformation, the speculation about what magic the new Duchess had worked to bring him back from the shadows. But the true transformation happened in private moments, in the slow dissolution of boundaries that had kept them separate even after their hearts had joined, as they discovered each other not just emotionally, but physically, tentatively, with a sweetness born of patience and mutual respect that made every touch feel sacred. Adrian would take her hand and press kisses to her palm, her wrist, the inside of her elbow, mapping her with reverent attention, and she would trace the lines of his face, the scar on his shoulder from that childhood fall, learning the geography of him with tender curiosity. They moved toward full intimacy gradually, over weeks rather than rushing, each step negotiated through whispered questions and breathless assent, and when they finally came together completely, it was with a gentleness that brought tears to Elara's eyes, a joining that felt less like passion's fire and more like coming home after a long exile. Afterwards, as they lay tangled in sheets bathed in moonlight streaming through the Duchess's chamber windows, Adrian traced patterns on her bare shoulder and whispered against her skin. "You brought me back to life. I was a ghost haunting these halls, going through the motions of existence but feeling nothing, and you refused to accept my living death, insisted I was still human, still capable of healing, still worthy of love." He pressed a kiss to her temple, and she could feel him smiling. "I don't believe in divine providence or fate, but if I did, I would say you were sent to save me." Elara turned in his arms, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "We saved each other," she corrected gently, and knew it for truth. Two broken people who had somehow, impossibly, found in each other the courage to become whole. The nightmare came in late June, on a night when summer had finally settled warm and gentle over Thornfield Manor, and Elara woke to the sound, not of screaming, but of soft, broken weeping, and turned in the bed they now shared to find Adrian sitting upright in the darkness, tears streaming down his face in the moonlight that spilled through the open windows. Her heart clenched with familiar concern, and she sat up immediately, reaching for him, expecting to find the terror and anguish that had characterized all his previous nightmares. But when he turned to her, his expression held something different, not fear, but a profound, almost peaceful sorrow, the kind of grief that comes not from wounds being torn open, but from their final, gentle closing. "I dreamed of Catherine," he said, his voice thick with tears but steady, and Elara prepared herself to offer comfort, to hold him through another recounting of that terrible night, but he shook his head as though reading her thoughts. No, it wasn't like before. She was standing in the garden, in the rose garden she loved, and she was smiling, truly smiling, the way she used to before. He paused, struggling with the wonder of it. She looked at me, and I knew the way you know things in dreams without words, that she wasn't trapped, wasn't suffering, wasn't waiting for me to join her in death. She was at peace, and she told me, his voice broke, and fresh tears spilled over. She told me to be happy. She said she had loved me, but that love doesn't chain us to the past, that her greatest wish was for me to live fully, to love again, to let her go not with guilt, but with gratitude for what we shared. He turned to Ilara fully now, taking her hands as though anchoring himself to this moment, to this reality. She smiled at you too, in the dream. She saw you beside me, and she approved. She was glad, oh God. Ilara, all this time I thought loving you was betraying her, and in the dream she was releasing me, blessing us, telling me that this is what she would have wanted. Ilara pulled him close, cradling his head against her shoulder as he wept. But these tears were different from all the ones that had come before. These were cleansing tears, the kind that wash away old pain rather than drowning in it, the kind that come when a long-carried burden is finally, blessedly set down. She held him as dawn gradually lightened the sky, turning it from deep blue to pale gold. And when the first birds began their morning songs, Adrian's tears had subsided into quiet breathing, and he lifted his head to look at her with eyes that seemed somehow lighter, clearer, as though a veil had been removed. "It's gone," he said softly, with a note of amazement. "The weight I've been carrying, it's gone. I can feel her absence still. I will always feel it. But the guilt, the crushing sense that I killed her, that I don't deserve happiness," he shook his head. "It's lifted." And as morning came fully, flooding their chamber with gentle summer light, both of them felt the truth of it. The past had finally, truly released its grip, leaving them free to walk forward into whatever future they would build together. 5 years had passed since that June morning when the weight of the past had finally lifted, and Thornfield Manor bore little resemblance to the silent, mourning place Ilara had first entered on that bleak autumn day. Now it was filled with light and warmth, and the particular chaos that comes with small children. For Adrian and Ilara had been blessed with two, William, who at 4 possessed his father's grey eyes and his mother's curiosity, and little Catherine, named in honour and not in sorrow, who at 2 was just discovering the joy of running through halls that had once been haunted by nothing but silence and grief. The manor rang with their laughter, with the sound of small feet on marble floors, with the endless questions and demands and delights of childhood, and the servants who had once walked on eggshells now smiled openly, their own happiness reflecting the transformation of the household they served. In the portrait gallery, Catherine Ashworth's painting still hung in its place of honour among the Thornfield ancestors, but beside it now hung a portrait of Ilara, commissioned on their 3rd anniversary, the two women equal in beauty and dignity, past and present coexisting without conflict. And Adrian had told their son when he asked about the 2 duchesses that both were important, both were loved, both deserved to be remembered, for healing was not erasure but integration, not forgetting but learning to carry memory with grace rather than anguish. The nightmares still came occasionally, perhaps twice a year now, but when they did, Adrian knew how to weather them, knew to wake Ilara, to speak of what he had seen, to let her hold him until the terror passed, and always he woke with gratitude for her presence rather than shame at his vulnerability. On this particular summer afternoon, Ilara worked in the rose garden that Catherine had planted and that she had restored and expanded. Her hands in the soil, her face turned up to catch the sun, while their children played nearby under the watchful eye of their nursemaid, and from his study window, Adrian watched them with a peace he had once thought impossible, a contentment so profound it sometimes moved him to tears, not of sorrow but of wonder, that life could transform so completely, that joy could follow despair, that love could bloom again in ground scorched by loss. Dear listener, if you have stayed with us through this long tale of grief and healing, know that its lessons are universal and true. Healing is not forgetting, it is learning to carry our wounds with grace while opening our hearts to new joy, accepting that scars are part of us but need not define us, understanding that the past deserves honor, but the present deserves our full presence. The darkest night gives way to dawn, If only we have the courage to wait for it, to remain open even when everything in us wants to close, to choose connection even when isolation seems safer. May you find your own peace in whatever storms you weather, your own second chance at happiness when you believe all chances are exhausted, your own patient companion who sees past your armor to the tender heart beneath. May you rest well tonight, knowing that transformation is always possible, that no winter lasts forever, that spring comes even to the most frozen ground. This story was brought to you by Tales of Hope and Healing. Subscribe for more stories of redemption, patience, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary hearts, learning to love again. Good night, dear listener, and may your own dreams be peaceful.